From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Roth. I work for the Library of Congress, where I serve as a cataloging specialist and as the library's recommending officer for Iceland. I am here to introduce you to one of America's preeminent poets, Heather McHugh. Poet, teacher, editor, translator, and literary critic, Heather McHugh has devoted her career to furthering the understanding and appreciation of poetry in the United States, and of course, the writing of it. She is a link to that great generation of American poets who came of age during and after World War II. Her first book was published in 1977. Her most recent book, Upgraded to Serious, came out in 2009. In between, 6 volumes of her poetry have appeared, as well as a collection of essays published under the title Broken English, Poetry and Partiality. Heather has received many prizes, grants, and honors. Her books have been nominated for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. In 2009, she was a recipient of the prestigious MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. But I doubt whether any of these honors mean as much to her as her relationships with the young poets she nurtures and mentors. By all accounts, Heather is a marvelous teacher. What makes the poetry of Heather McHugh so special? I quote from the MacArthur Foundation website. Heather McHugh is a poet whose intricately patterned compositions explore various aspects of the human condition and inspire wonder in the unexpected associations that language can evoke. In poems that are rich with wordplay, puns, rhymes, syntactical twists, she reveals the complex layers of meaning that individual words or phrases contain. The result is intellectually challenging, yet emotionally engaging verse that balances gravity with humor. I wish to add only that Heather's poems merit multiple readings. One of these readings should be out loud. Your tongues will delight in the exercise. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Heather McHugh.
Maybe is better than no, he said next door. There's poets everywhere. I've got to say it's been wonderful coming back here for many reasons. One was I went to junior high and high school over there in Arlington, land of cemeteries and mourning doves, and now land where my mother died on Christmas. So my last visit here actually was a very sad one. And it's wonderful to get to come back now to this place, which is my other family, the family of readers and writers. And it really is a homecoming, an important homecoming for me. Thank you. And to see old friends, as I did late into the night and was prompted to remember why I always loved Isaac Denison's Grand Aperçu. What is man when you come to think upon him but a minutely set, ingenious machine for turning with infinite artfulness the red wine of Shiraz into urine? That was my night. They are bad influences, those guys. Don't go out late with poets. That's my advice. So, howdy. You know, I'm old enough to remember, as my introducer implied, the duty that used to come after howdy, which would be all very sweet if your infant sensibility were not of such a scatological turn as mine was. I was a very scat-minded kid, and to this day, I won't shake hands with a clown. But howdy anyway. I have a few bones to pick with death, not only because my mother just endured it and it was, you know, I've seen 4 pets die and 4 people, and the pets each time had an easier time of it. Why should that be? My mother planned well ahead. You know, every time someone came to the door, she was clutching her DNR sign. She had chosen her hospice workers, and then fate had it. It was Christmas Eve, and they were out of town, the ones she had chosen. And she was dragged to the hospice, and increasingly those places are as busy as hospitals. And it took a little while for people to notice that she was having a bad reaction to morphine, and it helps to have someone there who is noticing all the time. So I have some bones to pick with death, 206 of them. Not least because a great and much beloved poet, Seamus Heaney, has just died. And he was an extremely kindly, generous man, generous with fellow poets, and generations just coming up behind him. Just enough of a scoundrel also to qualify as an XY to the sweeter genders XX. Who I assure you would never introduce their better halves at cocktail parties as my current spouse. The guy loved a turn of humor, and they were a wonderful match. I mean, she was by then quite used to it, but it was scandalous nonetheless. I'm hoping before I croak, they get more humane about humans dying. Because as old Dot Parker put it, razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, drugs cause cramp, guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. And the only part of that is still does not obtain today is the lawfulness of guns. The unlawfulness of guns, but they're all but pretty handily lawful now. But I don't want anyone to have to clean up after me. So, mostly what I learned at my mother's bedside then was how death is a kind of labor without a bundle of joy at the end of it. But I always loved the Emma Phillips outburst. I want to die in my sleep like my grandfather, not screaming in terror like his passengers. And although as a passenger, I'd look a lot better at the wake, because when my mouth is shut, which is so seldom is true, my chin is way too close to my nose. So had I been an opera singer, I would have been a lot more presentable. It's hard being an aesthete and an incarnation as well. But death can make you look better, it just won't make you look well. And as for self-knowledge, what was it? André Gide had it right when he assessed the old Greek adage, know thyself, as a maxim as pernicious as it is ugly. Whoever observes himself arrests his own development. A caterpillar who wanted to know himself would never become a butterfly, nor probably enjoy his caterpillar status all that much. It's a day to celebrate. In 1862, slavery in the United States, there was a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation released. And on this day in 1970, my favorite poet, Mystical, was born. But don't worry. He was pretty much sort of driven off the scene for his brutal lyrics. And I just want to assure all the parents out there that the kids aren't listening maliciously to the lyrics. Don't worry, the guy was the best musician since James Brown, so just you got to enjoy the music. My beloved would hasten to tell you that today is the day of the Bulgarian Revolution. And I would hasten to tell you that it's the day a patent was given out for the ice cream cone. That seems important to me. So I'm going to start with a poem, The Size of Spokane. There was a great little story that I heard once of a father who went up in a plane with his kid, and for the first time, the kid was buckled into his seat. He was silent as he was being buckled in, silent as the plane taxied along the runway, silent even as it took off and reached its cruising altitude, and finally turned to his father to say, "But when do we start getting smaller?" I've always loved that scale warp implicit in that kid's view, and half of what art is, it seems to me, is getting back that view that's uninflected by what you presume to be knowledge or what you've been made to think is knowledge. The Size of Spokane. The baby isn't cute. In fact, he's a homely little pale and headlong stumbler. Still, he's one of us, the human being stuck on Flight 295, Chicago to Spokane. And when he passes my seat twice at full tilt this, then that direction, I look down from Lethal Weapon 3 to see just why. He's running back and forth across a sun-blazed circle on the carpet, something brilliant fallen from a porthole. So, it's light amazing him. It's only light, despite some 3,500 people propped in rows for him to wonder at. It's light he can't get over, light he can't investigate enough, however many zones he runs across it, flickering himself. The umpteenth time I see him coming, I've had just about enough, but then he notices me noticing and stops, one fat hand on my armrest, to inspect the oddities of me. Some people cannot hear. Some people cannot walk. But everyone was sunstruck once and set adrift. Have we forgotten how astonishing this is? So practiced all our senses we cannot imagine them? Foreseen instead of seeing all there is? Each spectral port, each human eye is shot through with a hole, and everything we know goes in there where it feeds a blaze. In a flash, the baby's old. Mel Gibson's 100th comeback seems less clever. All his chases and embraces narrow down while we fly on in our plain radiance of vehicle toward what cannot stay small forever. Thank you. I'm of an age, having just applied for Medicare, I feel very proud. I can get into any national park now for the rest of my life for a single $10 payment. That is a glorious thing. There are so many perks. Cheap movies. I can use a cane, and almost everybody will, the C's part for you. It's wonderful. I'm having a hard time relinquishing some of the early and midlife tenacities of the flesh. Tallulah Bankhead said, "I've tried several kinds of sex. The conventional position makes me claustrophobic, and the others give me either a stiff neck or lockjaw." And, one feels a certain over-practiced. Lockjaw was great. I'll do it again. Lockjaw. And Chesterton on sex famously said that the pleasure was momentary, the posture ridiculous, and the expense damnable. So this is my granny's song. If the fact itself were not at odds with most of my hopes for human life, I'd want to know why sex was always best when we stood to lose the most. Why make its charms so devilishly proximal to risk? The patterns ought to favor children's best protection, not one parent hardened and one hurt, one predator, one weak. But nurturance appeared to have no part in our old fastest appetites, our grappling hooks and eye meats. Well, a mortally afflicted tree will scatter seed. That's nature's way of furthering its kind. In my own 60s, here where issue's not the issue, not unless I go to Delhi for an embryo implant, and let me tell you, I am not that nuts. Here, newly 65'd, I say, I'd settle for a kindness, tender looks over tenterhooks, a cuddle, not a cattle prod. Dear God, you made me pull away from every club and strut and hoe. Don't now, on my account, sweet chariot, swing so damn low. To go. Actually, let me leap to this, big ideas among Earthlings, since we're doing some scale swoops here. And since we're in the shadow of many monumental places and figures, big ideas among Earthlings. Who'd want to be the biggest one? The president or mastermind, the lord of stars or model of the kind? Who'd want the drove of sycophants, the plague of elitists and angels echoing the every word? A little loam and night soil is a lot. The miles unfurl inside a single iris, small hours in hot purple, wet gotten from eavesdropping. We craved our own lost halves ever since language and land were sundered into kind, and Africa misses South America and clouds their coast. And to this day, I love the fucker who deserted me, but who can claim to hold a soul, even her own? Americans think big is forceful, but the strongest force belongs to the electrons bound at 40,000 miles an hour about their far-off nuclei. From them we get our sense that matter's solid. You look about, above, for lords and kings, but given what we know of strangeness, given what we know of charm, perhaps the God is small, not big, who keeps us from harm. The best part of Amazing Grace, because you get really used to the first stanza, but I really love what I think is the second stanza. It's the one that has the line, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear." It's the one sort of unacceptable stanza, and so it's often left out in the singing, but it's the most moving one, not least because you don't hear it often, and you can be reawakened to its acerbic insight, the insight it can confer or corroborate in you. And I do a lot of scanning of books, chiefly for patterns in a way, as I do nature and the world. My attraction to art is a pattern lover's attraction. I know it may be a delusion. I know that the world may look so beautiful to me or so oddly ordered, if that's the pattern's attraction, simply because I have rods and cones in my eyes or whatever. And I know that I'm missing most of the wavelengths in all of my senses, all of my enumerated senses, as though there were only 5 conceivable. The 6th and 7th I leave unsung for the moment. But, you know, they operate in very narrow bands. It seems highly improbable that that's all there is. We just happen to be the creatures of those 5 bands. So the whole question of being, of philosophizing about being or knowing or saying or seeing seems preposterous in a certain way. And that's the essential comedy of academia, it seems to me, where I've spent my life. And thank God it feels like a comedy. Otherwise, I wouldn't have saved any money for retirement. I would have been out of there pretty damn fast. So I was reading an etymological dictionary, and believe me, I don't do this as a scholar. I'm not a born scholar. I don't want to be depressed. I don't want to be gloomy or stuck away from people all the time. It's just I have an appetite for patterns. And you know, jargon dictionaries, pouring my own concrete and being able to say bull float and screed. I love people's jargons. And there was some fun in the etymological dictionary to the sense that these words, that many words derive from words you can't imagine they came from. So I just selected a few of those. And this is a highly suspect etymological dictionary, academics have told me. But I did not change the poem because that's not the point. It's not about the truth. It's about the ludicrousness of the fact of it. Only 2 of them are inaccurate anyway. Calm comes from burning. Tall comes from fast. Comely doesn't come from come. Person comes from mask. The kin of charity is whore. The root of charity is dear. Incentive has its source in song, and winning in the sufferer. Afford yourself what you can carry out. A coward and a coda share a word. We get our ugliness from fear. We get our danger from the Lord. Who's my timekeeper? Do you have a... All right, I've got time. That voice was there yesterday. I'm going to do a quick, one more quick philosophical excursion. Recently, as my beloved from Bulgaria was eager to point out to me, a man was killed in a bar in a rural village in Russia after an argument about the philosopher Kant, which would never happen in America, I think. It just seems astonishing. It's sort of wondrous that there are countries in which that can still happen. I mean, where Kant can still inspire such feeling. Mostly he inspires in me a sense that the translators have made him pretty dead, deader than he even is. But Mencken says that, and I can't hold with Mencken entirely when he says that metaphysics is an attempt to prove the incredible by appeal to the unintelligible. But when you read translations of Kant, you think maybe he's right. I was at a time after one of the 4 people I cared so much about who had died and whose deaths I had been at, I was trying to leach out the pain in philosophy, somehow reading a lot of philosophy, and I was making an assault on Kant, and I noticed there was a whole lot of words he didn't even bother to further translate, and they don't in philosophy generally, like qua, like so being qua being, and language qua language, and being qua language, and saying qua seeing, and I finally just gave up. It just seemed hopeless to me because the quas overcame any other thing for me. Just the sheer numbers of quas it seized me up and sent me to the quill. There's a poem called Qua, Qua, Qua. I actually went down to the park in my frustration at the translation of Kant, and there were feathered philosophers saying nothing but qua, qua, qua. So, and this is an address to those ducks of Lake Union Park. Philosophical duck, it takes some fine conjunctive paste to put this nothing back together, gluing glue to glue. A fine conjunction and a weakness, too, inside the nature of the noun. Oh, duck, it doesn't bother you. You live in a dive. You daub the lawn, you dabble bodily aloft, more wakes awake where sheerness shares its force. The hot air moves you up, and then the cool removes. And for you, nothing is inanimate, it's just at rest. And as for as, it's just an alias, a form of time, a self of others, something between thinking and a thought. One minds his mom, one brains his brother. You seem so calm, O Cain of the corpus callosum, O fondler of pond life's fallopian gore, knowing nowheres the way we don't dare to, your web message subjectless, nothing a person could pray or pry predicates from. From a log to a logos and back, you go flinging the thing that you are, and you sing as you dare on a current of nerve, on a wing and a wing. Sometimes the thing you don't say is important in the poem. In fact, poems are all about the withheld stuff. The white space is the real moving part of every poem. One doesn't want to go too far along that road, but as Cage did. I feel sad. The only figure I feel sadder for than some of these philosophers who can't seem to get the word out in other languages. And I feel for Spinoza, not least because he was excommunicated in terrible terms. The edict of excommunication that was brought down against him in 1656 goes like this: "Let him be accursed by day and accursed by night. Let him be accursed in his lying down and accursed in his rising up, accursed in going out and accursed in coming in. May the Lord nevermore pardon or acknowledge him. May the wrath and displeasure of the Lord burn henceforth against this man. Load him with all the curses written in the book of the law and blot out his name from under the sky. No one may speak to him nor write to him. No one shall render him any service or stay under the same roof with him or within a distance of 4 yards, and none shall read anything written by him." Poor Spinoza, but you know, the only figure given all of that you could feel more sorry for is God, who's put to such uses by his adherents. So this is for a sad God. "I know God doesn't need my pity." And Spinoza says pity's a low emotion. "Still, it hurts my heart a little just to think of God's having to be so everywhere at once. No lumping up in an address or a throat. No hankering or humoring allowed for him. No big investment in a single self, in anybody's self. Not a single partiality like what erroneously, yes, we know as love. And so I send to God my humble range of sympathies. How mean my mountains, rivers, and eye rays must appear from there. But I understand no all or nothing, although human love has its own awful all or nothing it can practice failing at. I understand attachment and its cutting, care and its sad pseudonym. I know God doesn't need my pity, but if God is man, I feel I fear for him." I'll just do a couple more because I know that I should leave time. I love the Q's. I just really hate the A's, but I don't mean any ball team. God. Glass House I read actually I sort of made a little allusion to presidential monumental matters in this town. And in a way, you know, one of the reasons it seems to me you should never wish for your children to be famous or, you know, gloriously well known, or why I wouldn't want to be president or any such thing. First of all, it robs you of the chance to be anonymous. Most importantly, it robs you of the chance to be anonymous, and to be anonymous is a great liberty, a great joy that we squander all the time. Most of us, I mean, you know, we have a chance to see things unbothered by us, uninflected by us, unchanged by us. And I found this out in some ways too about beauty and great ugliness, that I married a guy who had a gorgeous daughter. She came over from Bulgaria, and when she arrived, I mean, first of all, she had glossy black hair, and there were steaming hunks of boy flesh on the porch just lining up. And after a year of McDonald's milkshakes, she was voluptuous, too. And even I felt strange. There was suddenly this woman with her head on my husband's lap and all this stuff. It was very, very strange. But I was her protector, and I was her friend. And to walk down a street with that girl was something like an experience I've never had in my life, because I can look at things and not, you know, interrupt them. Whereas she can't walk down a street without people's heads turning. And great disfigurement and great beauty have something in common. You want to, in a way, wish for your children some moderate thing. So this glass house is a kind of sympathy for high places. Everything obeyed our laws, and we just went on self-improving till a window gave us pause, and there the outside world was, moving. 5 apartment blocks swept by. The trees and ironwork and headstones of the next town's cemetery, auto lots, golf courses, rest homes, blue-green fields and perishable vistas wars had underscored in red were sweeping past with cloudscapes, just as if the living room were dead. Which way to look? Non-negative? Nonplussed? Unkilled? Unkissed? Look out, you said, the sight's on us. If we don't move, we can't be missed. I count on discerning readers to sense you know why poetry is good for politics, is good for people in general who get so pummeled with politics. I mean, human history is not political history. Human history is the history of individual families and lives and relationships and jobs and children and woes and sorrows written so finely into the fabric of a really grand tapestry. Not grand in the way historical, history is written as grand, with big monumental pounding things, hammers and war. And for me, poetry plays an important part in this only because it insists that you keep your mind open, that you not sign on with some monolithic notion in advance, that the power you give to any, say, one partisan party, it could be a way of having it easy. If you have to look at every instance, every case separately, the same goes for teaching, I've got to say. That it's easy to divide people up into 5 kinds, A, B, C, D, E, It's harder to pay attention to every character, every case, and try your best to open your mind and really hear what they're saying, or really entertain what their being means and brings to the occasion. Poetry does that in its nature because it's not that it's not precise. It is a very great precision in an instrument that is brought to bear on an uncontainability. I mean, really, it's concerned with an endlessness, with an uncontainability, an unfathomability, and incomprehensibility, which is our lives. And what it all means when mean doesn't mean intend. The other mean, like if someone asks you, what do you mean? And they don't mean, what do you mean by what you just said? They mean something you'll never be able to answer. After you're dead, they say what you mean. Or, it is written what you will mean. The difference between the transitive and the intransitive there becomes so potent. And that uncontainability of what we really mean, that we can't know, knowing can't know it, for me, that's the true province of art. And art brings to it a highly precise instrument, an instrument you have to practice a lot. You have to love the language. But as Seamus Heaney said, and I cherish that he said that in my work, language was relished and suspected, and equally relished and suspected. I know it can't say all there is. I have no arrogance about presuming on being or the nature of things. I'm too much of a skeptic for that. But I love the luxuries of its sensualities. I love the luxuries of all our senses. And that doesn't mean that, say, Jorge Luis Borges, who was blind since he was 4 years old and became the world's together with Nabokov, maybe the greatest novelist ever on earth, was in any way reduced. He wasn't. And he said, for example, a journalist would come up to him and shove a mic in his face and say, but isn't it a shame, Mr. Borges, that you're blind? Isn't it a shame that you'll never, doesn't that impede your work? And Borges, being very Borgesian himself, said, yes, of course it's a limitation, but it's also a liberation a solitude propitious to invention, a key, and an algebra. Whoa. Yeah, that's for Boris deserves every hand. Forever. You should read Garden of Forking Paths. He's an amazing, amazing writer. I just want to read two more, if I have time. Do I? I'm going to read The Gift, and the little political one I should have done is the Sutung Po poem. This is 6 lines long. Let me give you this first. On the Birth of a Son. He did a lot of poems about gardens, too, but then when they kicked him out of his provinces, he designed gardens. Sutung Po in China about 1,000 years ago, he designed beautiful gardens for governments, but then he kept wanting to write these satirical poems as well, and he would get booted out and then plant a new garden and write another satire. This is On the Birth of a Son. When a child is born, the parents say they hope it's healthy and intelligent. But as for me, well, vigor and intelligence have wrecked my life. I pray this baby we are seeing walloped, wiped, and winningly anointed turns out dumb as oakum and more sinister. That way, he'll crown a tranquil life by being appointed a cabinet minister. Oh, they must be giving away chocolates over there or something. When I start to feel a bit too big for my britches, I remember that Moby Dick sold a total of 50 copies in Melville's lifetime, and Alfred Hitchcock never won an Oscar for directing. And there are only two animals that mate face to face, us and the two-toed sloths. Also, apparently, due to turkey's high sulfur content, Americans on Thanksgiving produce enough gas to fly 75 Hindenburgs from New York City to LA. So when you're starting to feel grand, just remember all that. It's not necessarily the size you want. So I also remember when I'm at risk of, what the general says, the higher a monkey climbs, the more you see of his behind. That's good to remember. And then I also remember this guy. I met this guy, Fabio Doppelker, in Italy. He told me a story about yet another guy, Giordano Bruno. And I'm going to tell you that story now, and then I'll close with that. And essentially, it tells something, I think, too, of an artist's relationship to his work, that it doesn't matter whether your gift is with words. I mean, clearly you're here because they draw you or that you are moved by them. But one doesn't have to be a poet in any very sort of academic sense. There is the poetry I'm concerned with, I see in great basketball players. I see it in guys who do great work like a mason with a trowel. There are poets among them, and then there are the guys who are sloppy. It's just beautiful to see someone when his relationship to an instrument is that engaged and is that inspired. And every one of us has that in relation to something. It doesn't have to be poetry. I don't care so much about poetry per se. I care about that spirit that makes the human leap beyond what it thinks are its limits, hang in the air a little longer than physics should permit in order to make that basket. Or, and for all of us, there's some moment when you feel that way. It may be it's a moment of love of some kind. And I'm learning a lot about love in my old age, let me tell you. And some of it is caritas. That turns out not to be so flaky and untrue. Who knew? It's breathtaking. So what he thought for Fabio Doppelker. We were supposed to do a job in Italy, and full of our feeling for ourselves, our sense of being the poets from America, we went from Rome to Fano, met the mayor, mulled a couple matters over. What's cheap date, they asked us. What does flat drink mean? The Italians in the crowd apparently were all translating Ray Carver, because all the questions seemed to be about phrasings, like weird little phrasings. We were all ready to answer grand philosophical questions about poetry in the world, but no, flat drink. And then we disagreed about what flat drink meant, sort of, but especially about what cheap date meant. So everything opens up. The men and women on the panel had quite different accounts. Among Italian literati, we could recognize our counterparts, the academic, the apologist, the arrogant, the amorous, the brazen, and the glib. And there was one administrator, the conservative, in suit of regulation gray, who, like a good tour guide with measured pace and uninflected tone, narrated sights and histories the hired van hauled us past. Of all, he was most politic and least poetic, so it seemed. Our last few days in Rome, when all but 3 of the New World bards had flown, I found a book of poems this unprepossessing one had written. It was there in the pensione room, a room he'd recommended, where it must have been abandoned by the German visitor. Was there a bus of them? To whom he had inscribed and dated it a month before. I couldn't read Italian either, so I put the book back into the wardrobe's dark. We last Americans were due to leave tomorrow. For our parting evening then, our host chose something in a family restaurant, and there we sat and chatted, sat and chewed, till sensible it was our last big chance to be poetic, make our mark. One of us asked, "What's poetry? What's poetry? Is it the fruits and vegetables and marketplace of Campo dei Fiori, or the statue there?" Because I was the glib one, I identified the answer instantly. I didn't have to think. The truth is both. It's both, I blurted out. But that was easy. That was easiest to say. What followed taught me something about difficulty, for our underestimated host spoke out all of a sudden with a rising passion, and he said, "That statue represents Giordano Bruno, brought to be burned in the public square because of his offense against authority, which then was to say the church. His crime was his belief the universe does not revolve around the human being. God is no fixed point or central government, but rather is poured in waves through all things move. If God is not the soul itself, he is the soul of the world." Such was his heresy. The day they brought him forth to die, they feared he might incite the crowd. The man was famous for his eloquence. And so his captors placed upon his face an iron mask in which he could not speak. That's how they burned him. That is how he died, without a word, in front of everyone. And poetry, we'd all put down our forks by now to listen to the man in gray. He went on softly, "Poetry is what he thought but did not say." Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.